This is Dan Schneider, and on this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject will be American painter Andrew Wyeth, and I will be talking with three experts on his life and career. They are, left to right, David Cataforis, Joyce Stoner, and Henry Adams, and we will begin in a moment. In this first segment, I'd like to just give a little bit of background on who Andrew Wyeth was, because I never like to assume that people know the topics at hand. So let me start going left to right with David Cataforis. David, if you could introduce yourself for a minute or two, and then talk about your relationship to painting, art, and your interest in Andrew Wyeth.
Yes, my name is David Cataforis. I'm a professor of art history at the University of Kansas, also the chair of the department currently. I've been teaching at the University of Kansas for 23 years. And my interest in Andrew Wyeth goes back to childhood. I think many of us grew up seeing reproductions of Christina's World or other works by Wyeth. A galvanizing event for me was seeing the Helga picture show at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco in the mid-1980s. My advisor at Stanford, Wanda Korn, was and is a Wyeth expert. So I think that sort of by osmosis, I received from Wanda an interest in Wyeth. Later on, I had the opportunity to give some lectures on the Helga pictures when one of their subsequent tours was going around the United States. Then in the mid-1990s, here in Kansas, across the state line at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City, Missouri, the Andrew Wyeth autobiography show was staged, and I did some lecturing around that. So I had these sort of intersections with Wyeth at various points in my career. But what really brought me seriously into the Wyeth scholarly fold was editing a book that was published in 2014 by the University of California Press called Rethinking Andrew Wyeth. And this is a book of scholarly essays on Wyeth by a team of 9 different authors. And Wanda Korn is among them. Joyce Hill-Stoner with us today is among them. I also learned a lot from Henry Adams writing on Wyeth. So I feel like there's a lot of scholars now, over the last decade or so, who have really started to take Wyeth seriously. And I'm glad to have this opportunity to speak more about that.
Yes, thank you, David. I believe, if I'm correct, Wanda Korn was one of the first people I actually contacted. I forget whether it was you or Joyce that she may have recommended, but the name is familiar, and anyone who looks up or Googles Wyeth's name will be familiar with her name. So in the center, Joyce Stoner, like David, if you could give a little bit of your background and interest in Wyeth.
Okay, well, I have been for 40 years teaching painting conservation at the University of Delaware and Winterthur Museum. And in 1982, I interviewed Jamie Wyeth because one of the most fabulous things for a painting conservator is to get to know the artist you're actually treating and find out. And we were having a time in art conservation at that point of trying to understand. Robert Motherwell didn't want his paintings varnished, threw away one, destroyed it because someone had varnished it. So we felt we needed to know this sort of thing from the artists themselves. So I interviewed Jamie in 1982, found out he varnishes only the eye of the goose, and some other conservator had varnished the whole thing, and getting into that. And then in, 1997, I was asked to put together a technical appendix for the show Wondrous Strange and show how Howard Pyle influenced N.C. Wyeth, influenced Andrew, influenced Jamie. And that actually came out, I'll show this little book, came out in 1998. And I got to know Andrew Wyeth from interviewing him, was fascinated because so many of my peers, my own art history teachers, had warned me against him, made fun of him, etc., etc. And I thought, this marvelous man is 80 years old and no one is paying attention. People could rush in and interview him, and I seemed to be the only one at the door. I became his conservator for the next 12 years and did a number of essays about Nancy, Andrew, and Jamie, and 2 exhibitions, and have had a fabulous time. Thank you, David. Wyeth Vertigo, showing how the Wyeths not only paint vertiginous paintings from bird's eye or worm's eye view, but also having a dinner party with them is also highly vertiginous, with all kinds of challenging questions and so forth. So I entered Wyeth's world fully in about 1997 and have enjoyed it thoroughly. Andrew Wyeth would come and visit. I'm sitting in the paintings conservation studio at Winterthur, and for the 12 years I served as his conservator, his last 12 years, all of my graduate students met him. He came in, looked over our shoulders, and also painted my portrait, which is right back here.
Thank you, Joyce. By the way, before I get up to Henry, I should mention that I'm not going to put any images from Andrew Wyeth online because I had twice contacted his estate and I didn't get permission. And while technically, I guess, free use, this could be considered an educational broadcast, I'm not going to risk it because YouTube sometimes gets really nasty about violations of copyright. But I think if any of you, if we're talking about a particular painting, if you have your book there and want to hold it up and and show it, that should be fine. The third member of the panel, even though it says Mason McClue, is actually Henry Adams. And Henry, if you could, like Joyce and David before, give a little bit of precis on who you are and your views on Wyeth.
I teach at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland. I've written widely over the American field from the 7 topics ranging from the 17th century to the present. I got to know Andrew Wyeth's work in high school or earlier. I grew up in New England, and obviously, I saw reproductions of his work. There's a particular resonance, I think, if you grow up in New England, because it really is the world you are living in that he captured. One of the great events of my early life was when I went to a Wyeth drawing and watercolor show at the Fog Art Museum that had been curated by Philip Hofer and Agnes Mongan. And I remember going there with my father and being sort of swept away both by the technique and also by this curious sense of emotion that he gets in his paintings, and representing a tree or a beach story or whatever. There's just some very peculiar, slightly eerie, enigmatic New England quality that he gets in his work. I didn't write about Wyeth's work until relatively late in my career. I had the opportunity to do an exhibition catalog of his drawings at the Brandywine Museum, and that also roughly coincided with I wrote a book on Thomas Eakins, which it turned out that Andrew Wyeth liked. It was a very dark book. I think there are only 2 people who liked it, both now dead. But anyway, I had a marvelous opportunity. It actually was sort of an overwhelming experience. I went out to the mill and spent something like 2 hours in conversation with Andrew Wyeth and Jamie, and we talked about Eakins, but also about his work and about American art and all kinds of things. And it actually was only when I got up, I was facing the window, that I realized that I was in this room full of amazing Andrew Wyeth paintings, which I hadn't even noticed because he was so captivating. And I'd have to say that he was a very charismatic, captivating personality. Sometimes I think he should have been an actor rather than a painter. I mean, don't you think he would have been a wonderful Richard III? He would have done wicked things and make you love him entirely. So I feel jealous of Joyce because I only got to meet him 4 or 5 times, but each of those meetings was very memorable. I once went up to do some research at the Farnsworth Museum, and I think he had been tipped off that I was there because he and Betsy showed up in the print room accidentally when I was there, and we ended up eating hot dogs together in the print room, which is something you don't usually do, but apparently you can do if you're with Andrew Wyeth. Anyway, I think he's an amazing artist, and also he was completely charismatic and captivating.
Well, let me the 2 points that were raised by your 3 introductions, I want to fill out the rest of this segment with. The second point, which I'll touch on in a moment, is basically his life and the fact that he came from a father who was a well-known illustrator, and he also has a son who's a painter. But I wanted to talk a bit about his reputation. I'll pick up a little bit later in the interview about how he's been viewed critically, but it's something that I've never really understood. I mean, I know that he came of age, or he came into his prime basically during the height of abstract expressionism, and I've never been a big fan of abstract expressionism. I mean, I have no problem with uh, symbolism and metaphor in any art, but I think that went so far overboard that there was a kind of condescending snobbery towards someone like a Wyeth. And just as a lay person, I think you can draw a clear line, and I'll just throw out the names of a few painters that I see in him. Vermeer, the use of space, the empty space in a lot of his paintings. I forget the name of it. There's my own personal favorite painting of his is one where there's a little shack and there's a tree and there's a dead animal body hanging from the end of a tree.
Tenant farmer.
Okay, yeah. And Edward Hopper, to me, he seems to be the rural version of Hopper, too, in that when he does paint people, they always seem to be not really looking at the canvas. I mean, Hopper has those famous black eyes of his people, but Wyatt's people are sort of indifferent to whoever the observer is. I also think of you mentioned people like Akins and Homer. I think he's clearly in that vein. And even though he's not an urban painter like the Ashcan, there's a realism in his paintings that comes through. And finally, I think there's a touch of the Hudson River School painters, although he's sort of the opposite emotionally. His paintings are sort of emotionally muted and in the little moments rather than the grand and spectacular. So let me just start with that as a base. And if any or all three of you want to talk a little bit about the mid-century sort of denigration of Wyeth and people who were doing figurative painting.
David has written about this so gorgeously. David, can you take this?
Well, I think at mid-century, it was not as clear-cut as it looks today in terms of the triumph of the abstract expressionists. I think that, for example, the Museum of Modern Art was still collecting more representational examples of American art. I mean, they bought Christina's World actually before they bought their first Jackson Pollock. So, and actually, in my book, Katie Robinson Edwards has written about this sort of moment around 1950 when the question of who's really going to be anointed the modern master is kind of a toss-up between Pollock and Wyeth, and that seems hard to believe today. But I wouldn't overstate the kind of triumph of abstract expressionism at that moment. Obviously, by the 1960s, the abstract expressionists have won, but then they're being eclipsed by the pop artists and the minimalists, etc. And so that sort of set of movements sort of battling out for supremacy goes on, and Wyeth is sort of put to the side and seen as somehow out of step with that modernist juggernaut of progress. But I think we shouldn't discount the connections between Wyeth and the abstract expressionists. I think that they were both fundamentally concerned with expressing emotion or expressing feelings. And the abstract expressionists did it through non-representational means, and Wyeth did it through representational means. So there's a kind of shared sensibility that I think you find in the work of both artists. And I think some of the abstract expressionists like Mark Rothko actually had respect for Wyeth, recognized that he was working in a different idiom, but that the kind of emotional quality he was seeking was resonant with their own. So you're right that Wyeth sort of had his first peak of critical success in the late 40s and early 50s, but that's exactly when the abstract expressionists were sort of hitting their stride.
Joyce, do you have any comment on that?
Well, I just wanted to add that because I have such intimate contact with the works, how much, if you get very close to Andrew Wyeth's grass, it looks like a Jackson Pollock.
Yeah.
He spatters and splashes. And he was aware of that and would make comments to that effect.
Yeah, I was going to mention that, probably his most famous painting, Christina's World, the sort of lower right quadrant, if you just took that as a painting, it's certainly an abstract expressionism, but it's abstract expressionism used as a tool to serve a higher purpose. Henry, any comment?
I have a couple of thoughts, and I think it's interesting that when Andrew Wyeth first came on the scene, he enjoyed an extraordinary wave of success, and people like Bernard Berenson admired his work. Winston Churchill once came to Boston and asked that 2 Wyeth watercolors be brought to his hotel. Robert Frost admired his work and used to borrow a Wyeth painting from a friend of his, tried to get Wyeth to illustrate a book of his poems. And also some sort of unusual figures. Lincoln Kirstein, who founded the New York City Ballet, was a great admirer and supporter of Andrew Wyeth. There's a kind of shift that takes place, I think, probably in the 1970s. It's always seemed to me that there are a couple of aspects to that. Ironically, I think the fact that Wyeth had the first one-man show of a living artist at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which was arranged by Thomas Hoving. But behind the scenes, that was a very controversial enterprise. And Henry Geltzeller, who originally was going to be curator, sort of pulled out of that project. There are various sort of legends and rumors and about why that was the case. But basically, that was the point at which people like Geltzeller decided that they were going to sort of take the New York side of things and be supportive of abstract expressionism, pop art, that kind of thing. And Wyeth, who Geltzeller had originally admired, was sort of pushed out. It's also seemed to me that one aspect of this is the way Wyeth's work was handled by art dealers, that at some point Betsy Wyeth decided that she wasn't satisfied with the way the New York art dealers were handling his work. There's a guy named Frank Fowler, who's down in South Carolina, who's been handling his work. And I guess I'd also say that many of the people who bought Andrew Wyeth's work were politically very conservative. There was a strong Hollywood interest in his work. People like Charlton Heston were huge supporters. So that I think that Wyeth, at some point in the 1970s, got sort of ostracized from the New York art world. One indication of this is I think Christina's World is probably the most popular, widely reproduced painting in the Museum of Modern Art. Andrew Wyeth was not invited to the 50th anniversary of the Museum of Modern Art, which I think is sort of funny in some regards. And I think one of the things that's we seem to be in a phase where there's a huge interest among young art historians in Andrew Wyeth, and I think even 10 years ago, one would never have anticipated this. It seems to be almost a grassroots phenomenon. It's something that isn't simply a bunch of friends getting together. It seems to be a phenomenon that's emerging from different places, but Wyeth seems to be very relevant to whatever it is artists are doing today and what we're concerned with today.
Well, let's get a little biographical then for people who are novices and are just hearing about this and may want to explore Andrew Wyeth. His father, N.C. Wyeth, was probably, along with, in my pantheon of names, along with Norman Rockwell and Rockwell Kent, one of the three maybe most famous illustrators in the early 20th century when magazine covers and children's book illustrations dominated. So that's the father he came from.
Can I go back a little further than that?
Okay.
Because you have to start with Howard Pyle.
Okay.
And Howard Pyle was the father of the Brandywine School of Illustration, born in 1853, and in fact, Theo Van Gogh, Vincent's brother, William Morris, and other Europeans said, "Who is this wonderful American painter?" And Andrew so often quoted Howard Pyle, and so many of his ideas of varying emotional messages and things of that sort were from Howard Pyle. And then, of course, you always have this generational leap where Jamie harkens back to NC, but Andrew harkens back to his what he calls his spiritual grandfather, Howard Pyle. And Howard Pyle taught 100 students at least, and NC and Harvey Dunn were thought to be the most talented of his two. So NC goes through a great struggle of liking Pyle, rebelling from Pyle, and that's a wonderful. That could be a movie easily. Struggle of denying or being showing allegiance to Pyle, and so NC, as you say, was a great illustrator, and everyone loves his books, his illustrations of Treasure Island and Kidnapped, and he was very strong. When I was first researching this, I would try to get all the books he illustrated when I was working on the paintings, and sometimes I couldn't get the actual book out of the rare book room, so I'd get the book illustrated by somebody else. And that was a real lesson because with the idea of having abstract forms and negative shapes and wonderful diagonals that Howard Pyle taught, NC was far ahead of his competitors. And Howard Pyle would say, turn your back, have someone with the back turn, so you want to grab him and turn him to look and see what he's seeing. So these principles of illustration that Pyle taught NC then went way beyond Pyle and excelled. Pyle would paint little bitty versions of the paintings to be illustrated, and then NC would paint great big versions, even though it was only going to be this big on the actual book. And one of the quotes to Andrew was, your father's illustrations can't stay on the page. They leap off the page because they're big and brilliant and bright. And whenever I'm in painting, retouching on an NC Wyeth, you can just look at my palette. People will look at the palette and say, oh, you're working on an NC Wyeth because their colors are so bright. So here's Andrew rebelling from his father as he goes into using these muted yellows and grays. And when he first, although, again, you've got all these contradictions, his one-man show, he's only 20 years old in 1937, of watercolors sells out. And so then you're going to get father-son tension. NC writes that his son is so great he's fallen into dark despair. So you've got this father-son competition going. It's a fascinating story all the way through. But yes, NC is trained by Pyle, and then Andrew's father is NC. And it is quite something to have a father like that. Larger than life is what most people said about NC. And he brought up these 5 incredible children. When I read about NC, I feel like I'm a terrible mother because NC would act out Santa Claus, would take his children up hills, teach them to grow their own food. He was very fond of the land and the sea, and you'll see that in Andrew's paintings. Andrew was born in a working farm. And so the whole idea of injecting all of this excitement about Robin Hood and going into the forest and acting out things. So Andrew, there are all these wonderful family pictures of Andrew at 6 and 9 with his bow and arrow and racing through the woods where his father had actually illustrated Robin Hood and so forth. So I'll turn over to my colleagues so I don't talk too long.
Go ahead, Henry.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think Howard Pyle is interesting because Howard Pyle was someone who really looked at the history of art. He was a sort of synthetic illustrator, and he had an Albert Dürer style. He had a sort of 19th century realist style, and I think that Andrew Wyeth absorbed a lot of the history of art through Howard Pyle and through the things that Pyle had been interested in. He would pick up on, let's say, the Dürer influence, and then that would lead Andrew Wyeth, into looking at the art of Dürer as well. And of course, he also looked at paintings in the Philadelphia Museum, things like, Van der Weyden and Van Eyck and that kind of thing. So that there's a lot of the sort of whole history of art that Andrew Wyeth is absorbing in a very personal way in his childhood. Of course, the whole relationship with his father is very interesting. Andrew Wyeth's first success was with these rather boldly colored watercolors, somewhat in the vein of Winslow Homer. And then around the time that Andrew Wyeth married Betsy James, he shifts from oil to tempera and also starts doing these paintings that are rather drab in color and more sensitive in emotion, which his father didn't like. And, there's a good deal of tension there. And then, of course, his father died very tragically, when he was with his grandson and their car was hit by a train, sort of a mysterious episode as to what was going on, why the car stopped. Um, but anyway, that traumatic event seems to have set the stage for Andrew Wyeth's greatest paintings. He did a painting called Winter 1947, which is a kind of somewhat crazed looking young man who's running down a hill, and the key to that painting is he's running down to the place where N.C. Wyeth was killed. And then just after that, he does Christina's World, which was, of course, his breakthrough painting. It was acquired by the Museum of Modern Art, and almost immediately it became, one of the most famous paintings, in the whole canon of American art. It was widely reproduced in posters. But there is this, how would I say, Andrew Wyeth had. N.C. Wyeth was at once a nurturing figure to his son, but there also clearly was a huge tension there. I think N.C. Wyeth was clearly bipolar, and in the early part of his career, it seems as though it was the kind of frenetic energy that came to the fore, but by the end of his life, it's clear that he was seriously depressed, insecure about the worth of his painting, and a lot of insecurity about the fact that his son Andrew was becoming more famous than he was. I might say that I do think that N.C. Wyeth is one of the great figures in American art and probably underrated. I think that he's valued as an illustrator, but I think if you look at his work, I would rank him, with figures like John Sloan and Stuart Davis, maybe not at the very top of American art. He's probably not a Winslow Homer or Thomas Eakins, but he's just below that.
You know,
And there are interesting parallels. I mentioned that N.C. Wyeth's most famous painting is probably Blind Pew from Treasure Island, but it has to do with this maimed figure who's blindly groping down this road. And if you put that beside Christina's World, there are a lot of interesting parallels. There are some interesting dark themes that seem to run through the Wyeth family.
yeah, when Joyce mentioned Howard Pyle, I immediately thought, oh, that's the fellow from the Robin Hood book. As a child, back in the late 60s, early 70s, I remember my mom would get this series of children's books at the local A&P every month would come out, and there was Howard Pyle, who I think he also edited Robin Hood as well. David.
Howard Pyle was quite a good writer also.
Yeah.
So wrote a number of books. And actually, one of the things, Andrew Wyeth had a little room in his house filled with amazing first editions of Howard Pyle books, many of them signed, and also books his father had illustrated.
Well, David, or any of you, let me talk about his siblings. You had mentioned the siblings. Were the rest of the Wyeth siblings, Andrew's four siblings, were they artists? How did he get along with them, and what was family life growing up? Was it a nurturing environment? You talked a bit about the father, but how about the mother and the siblings?
The mother was the source of unconditional love, and the father was the business manager. The father didn't want any of them to get married. In fact, tried to pay Andrew not to marry Betsy. And he did this with each of them. And so Henriette, who is the oldest, she married Peter Hurd, and that's a whole nother. Peter Hurd is the person who introduces the tempera technique to the Wyeth family. So Peter Hurd becomes extremely important. But he married Henriette. He wanted to take her. She was a practicing artist. She studied at the Pennsylvania Academy. And if you want to distinguish their techniques, I sort of call Henriette the Monet Wyeth, and then Carolyn is kind of the Van Gogh, but with no impasto, if you look at their kinds of compositions and techniques. But four of the five were practicing artists. And just to finish that thought, Henriette married Peter Hurd. He had a wonderful home in Roswell, New Mexico, but NC would not let her go for 10 years. So they got married in 1929, but Peter Hurd couldn't move her to his house in New Mexico until 1939. And the only one of the five that didn't paint was Nat, who was an inventor, and he had over 22 patents for the DuPont company, including the plastic Coke bottle. So again, this nurturing and terrifying and exciting and stimulating father. All five of these children did something exciting. Anne and Andrew were the babies and were sort of coddled by the others. Anne collected dolls. They still do shows of her doll houses at the Brandywine River Museum. But Anne also composed, and NC arranged for her symphonies to be played by the Philadelphia Orchestra. So you've got a very busy family. And in the big house where Andrew was born, there's a piano, of course, where Anne would play, and Anne would write music about Carl Kerner, one of Andrew's favorite subjects. So there was Anne composing away things about what NC and what her brother was doing. And then Anne married John McCoy, who was from DuPont, but also a painter. And so you've got this family of painters, except one very competent inventor, marrying painters. So it's quite an interesting group.
Let's end this segment talking about just a little bit about the choice of tempera and watercolor versus traditional oils that Wyeth moved away from. I know as a layman, when I go to a gallery and see paintings, sometimes you can see painting lightly dabbed on. Other times you can see swirls where it's a quarter of an inch above the canvas and whatnot. So for us lay people, if you could just one or you people just tell us a little bit about the differences between oil versus tempera or gouache or watercolor, and how that affected the way Wyeth's view upon what his subjects were.
Can I take that one?
Yeah. That's for you, Joyce.
So he started with oil, which is what his father was superb in. Later, Andrew said that oil is like Beethoven, and watercolor and tempera are like Bach. And so if you go from that, the power and color of oil, because oil is thick and rich, all three contain ground minerals, usually pigments or coal tar dye stuffs, and are put with different media. So if you're going to make oil color, you grind it. All our students have to do this with a muller and make a thick paste. And with this, you can have impasto and ridges. Think Van Gogh. And then if you mix with watercolor, you're using gum arabic. And so NC did do watercolor, but one of the things I got so involved with the Wyeth family 4 generations is looking at these media and how they impacted. So Howard Pyle did a lot more watercolor, and Andrew, in jumping away from the oil, he did oils when he was younger, abandoned them, picked up tempera from his brother-in-law, Peter Hurd, and excelled at that, and that separated him from his father. When you look at the surface of a tempera, it comes with a certain historicizing vein. In other words, you think of the Italian temperas of the 14th and 15th century, which is, I think, another thing involved with how Andrew Wyeth was treated as a sort of traditionalist to be shunned and ejected, because the surfaces of his paintings are flat and look like Roger van der Weyden or look like Botticelli he in his fact, there's a wonderful quote where Andrew and NC go to the Museum of Modern Art in 1940. This is such an odd thing. Why would the Museum of Modern Art in 1940 be exhibiting Botticelli's Birth of Venus? But another story is that Mussolini was circulating Italian art to raise interest. Lincoln Kirsten talks about this. Anyway, raise interest in Italian art. So he brings Botticelli, he sends, and they have 3 stops, California, Chicago, and New York. And so NC and Andrew go up and see Botticelli's Birth of Venus, and Andrew has a speech about how this is when he realizes the true meaning of tempera, the value of tempera, the dryness of tempera, and he compares tempera to a mummy, to a bee's nest, to dry dead flies. And so his tempera paintings have with it this emotion of aloneness and mummy and death and quiet, whereas the N.C. Wyeth oils are exploding with color and three-dimensional. And then you have to add one, as Henry mentioned, Dürer. Dürer, we can all picture the beautiful hair, the rabbit that Dürer painted with dry brush, and you squeeze almost all of the water out of the brush and make these extraordinary fine lines. And Andrew was a sickly child. He dropped out of school in first grade, and while he was homesick, NC brought him a book on Dürer, and he fell in love with that hair. And so Andrew has tempera, watercolor, which is wet and explosive also in its exploding way, but then dry brush, which he can do the hair. If you look at the hair, you can see in Helga's hair, and Siri's hair, and Margaret Handy's hair, this fabulous dry brush that comes from, the other hair, Hare, of Dürer. And so you've got these three techniques, which he sometimes jumps from one to the other, but he has different worlds. We all know his two worlds are Chatsford and Pennsylvania, but he has these two worlds of tempera and watercolor. Tempera highly direct and tight and organized, and watercolor explosive and splashed, and then dry brush is kind of in the middle.
Joyce, you didn't mention egg yolk.
Well, sorry, thank you. How do you make tempera? We had a wonderful show with Michael Palin of Monty Python, and we taught him how to make egg tempera. But you of course break the egg, and you put the egg back and forth in the shell, getting rid of the sac around you get rid of the white. You go back and forth with the yellow, hold the yellow, pierce it, and that is what goes into a little cup. And you mix that instead of, in oil paint, you grind your pigments with oil. In tempera, you grind them with the egg yolk and a little bit of water. And Betsy was famous for her meringues, because the joke was Andrew took the yolk, threw away the white, and Betsy would make these extraordinary meringues, and always did. And if you went to any of Andrew Wyeth's studios in Port Clyde or in Pennsylvania, look by the window and you see all these eggshells, because you have to constantly make egg tempera fresh. And later, when Helga became his studio assistant, she was the one to break the eggs and make the tempera. And of course, this all goes back to Cennino Cennini's instruction of how to make tempera, which went to Peter Hurd and went to Andrew and to NC. And so when you first meet Andrew Wyeth and asks you about the tempera, he hands you this handout that came from Cennino Cennini via Peter Hurd. But the first thing I said when I looked at it, which is you have to do a green underpaint, is you don't do this really. And that's how our friendship began, because he realized that he couldn't just hand this and get rid of me, because he stopped doing the green underpainting after about 2 years of working with Peter Hurd, and began to splash his tempera in ways that are nothing like Italian Renaissance tempera.
Okay, well, let's go ahead, Henry.
I was just going to add that one of the differences with oil and tempera is that oil dries extremely slowly. It actually takes months to fully dry, whereas tempera dries almost instantly like watercolor. And there's a different, it's sort of physical, there's a different psychology to being a tempera and watercolor painter than being an oil painter. In terms of Andrew Wyeth's work, I do think it's interesting. He plays off watercolor and tempera in an interesting way, because he did his watercolors extremely quickly. He often did a completely finished watercolor in 20 minutes, which is, quite amazing. Whereas the temperas, actually, he's spending more time than seems rational professional, he's often spending 6 months on a single painting, and often spending 4 or 5 of those months painting something that seems like it's nothing at all, like a wall or a field of grass or whatever. One of the interesting things about Wyeth's work is, I mean, just with Christina's World, he worked for months on the grass and then he did the figure in a few days. And it's those areas that would be background for most painters, which are where Andrew Wyeth is putting most of the work.
Oh, and I want to add that Henry, since you did that beautiful book on the drawing, I should say, I always would say the watercolor and the tempera, but you make a beautiful case for his use of the drawings and the graphite.
Yeah, and I think he's technically inventive to a degree that hasn't been recognized. Both his watercolors are using splattering and splashing, and his dry brush technique is a little bit like Dürer, but it goes beyond anything Dürer did. It's really almost a newly invented technique. And with his tempera also, I think that Joyce touched on that, but one of the things that makes his temperas different as well, there's a lot of detail. The underpainting is very free and fluid, and that somehow comes through. A lot of these people who paint every blade of grass, you know, the paintings are dull, and they're dry, and there's an emotion and fluidity to the way that Andrew Wyeth handles temper that's really quite unique. There's no one else who's ever come close to that I'm aware of.
All right, well, let's end this segment, and in the next segment, let us talk about some of the major themes in Wyeth's work, some of his more famous works, and some lesser-known works, too, that you people think have been sort of neglected, and we'll do that in a moment. All right, I am back and speaking with 3 experts on Andrew Wyeth. When your average person hears the name Andrew Wyeth, 2 female names come to mind, Christina and Helga, and certainly I want to talk about those works, but I want to talk a little bit more and get a little deeper and talk about some of the major themes that you think run through Andrew Wyeth's work, where these themes may have emerged from, his personal life, his political views, his religion, if he had any, and then also talk a little bit about some other works of his that you think are underrated, and if you have any, if you want to flash any of the images of them, that's fine. So let me start with David. Let's talk about what you would consider some of the major themes in Andrew Wyeth and some of his underrated works or less known works.
Well, let me provide some context for that question. It's already been mentioned that Wyeth basically had 2 locales in which he basically lived and worked, and that nourished his art. One is his birthplace of Chatsford, Pennsylvania, the rural area around it, which is basically farm country, and then his summer precinct near the coast in Maine, Port Clyde and later Cushing, and that's where he paints Christina's World. So his themes come out of his immersion in these environments and his connection with these places and with the people who live there. So his art is very personal. It's very intimate in that sense. These are places and people that he knows well, and you know, some of his critics say that his world is too limited, it's too circumscribed. But you can turn that around and see that as a strength, because his art is so deeply rooted in these places and is infused with the emotion and the feeling that he has for these people and places, that I think that's the fundamental content of his art. And we've talked already about the technical means that he uses to plumb these emotional depths. So Wyeth always insisted that his surface realism is infused with and supported by a deep well of emotion. So you mentioned Christina, you mentioned Helga, and there are certain models that he forms an attachment to and represents over and over again. And then there are certain places. I would say the Kerner Farm is another of his great subjects, and that's really more about the land and the architecture and the interior spaces. And Wyeth knows who lives and works there, and sees a whole world in this very sort of modest old Pennsylvania farmhouse right off of the road. So, one of his well-known pictures that you didn't mention is called Groundhog Day, 1959, I believe, and that's a very pared-down image of the Kerner kitchen. Very simple iconography with a corner of a table, a cup and saucer, a knife, the side of the wall with some patterned wallpaper, a window through which you look onto the yard outside with a sawed-off log and a chain around it. So this very distilled, quiet, luminous image for Wyeth is full of everything he knows and feels about the Kerners and their life and their environment. And he wouldn't be able to make a painting like that without that kind of feeling for the place and the people that really impels him to make art.
Yeah, you'd mentioned earlier, believe it was you, David, who'd mentioned his use of perspective and eagle's eye shot. I'm actually looking on my other computer. I think it looks like buzzards, three buzzards or so flying way above a home. And that's another painting that's always stuck with me. And I don't know if you're familiar. There was a in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a famous documentary about 10 minutes long called Powers of 10, where you see a couple in a Chicago park, and you go back 10 feet and then 100 feet and until you get out to the size of the universe. It was called Powers of 10. I think it won an Oscar. And I always have seen a few of those paintings and of these different pulled back shots from a shot that no human being at the time he was painting would have been able to see. And it makes me think of that. How many of his paintings are sort of like that have these unusual views that probably very few people, if any, had ever taken before?
Joyce has to take this question.
Well, that was the point of the exhibition we did in Shelburne, which was called Wyeth Vertigo. And it featured, in fact, all three of them, NC, Andrew, and Jamie, views that are so peculiar, in many cases, couldn't be imitated. People were asking me, did Andrew go up in airplanes and look down? How did he get this ability? When he was being trained by his father would say, paint this skeleton, paint it from this side, paint it from this side. Now I'm taking away the skeleton and paint it as if you're looking at it from up in a tree. So it would be training of the imagination and training of being able to put yourself in a view you cannot be. So soaring is amazing, and you can also compare it to the fact people think that Andrew Wyeth is isolated from what's going on in the rest of the world, but you can carefully look and see that soaring is in the middle of the fear of World War II and bombing, and they were having blackouts in Maine thinking they were about to be bombed in Maine. It was all around the idea of danger coming from the air. So you've got the sense in soaring of these buzzards looking down at this teeny little farmhouse of this helpless situation. And then with his dead crow that's at the Whitney, oh dear, what's it called? Winterfields? Anyway, that's a worm's eye view. So you've got the looking down from bird's eye, you've got looking up, and the dead crow. Why is he painting a dead crow? Well, this is right also in the middle of World War II, and we're seeing a very extreme version of vision that calls, and Richard Merriman, Andrew Wyeth's biographer, said that you can put behind every Andrew Wyeth painting sex and death. And so there's a lot of death, and the soaring is death. The dead crow, of course, is death. He has other woodshed is dead crows against the wood, because Carl Kerner, who puts that deer that in the painting you like, Tenet's farmer, who shot and killed the deer and hung it from the tree. And Andrew was fascinated with this beautiful, vibrant creature and its little hooves now hanging there. And Groundhog Day, he felt that the tree out in the back that you see the sawed pricky edges of is again part of death, and the way of death with Carl Kerner and shooting animals and World War II. So there's so much subtext in these paintings, and these views that you mentioned are extreme ways of getting you to feel this emotion and to be unbalanced. And see has you near the edge of a cliff. Right after 9/11, Andrew's first painting was called On the Edge of Anne Call on a huge cliff. So the idea of cliffs and vertigo and NC has people hanging from a cliff. Jamie has got icebergs coming at you. So it's very unsettling and intentionally so.
I happen to be born on February 2nd, so that resonates a little bit with me. I wanted to ask you, Joyce, and then I'll ask Henry. Give me a couple of paintings from the Wyeth canon that you would rank as underrated, or something that represents something people don't necessarily associate with Wyeth, something that demonstrates his versatility.
Well, one of my favorites that's not very well known is called Long Limb, and it's a huge painting of. It looks almost like a pterodactyl crossing the grass, but it's just the limb of a tree, and he actually used some gold leaf in the falling apart dead leaves, and he said that because so many of his friends were dying, that each of these lost leaves was a dead friend. And it has golden grass. It's got the golden grass of Christina's World. It's got the um, leaves that are just fragile and see-through, and it's a fabulous painting. And Richard Merriman's favorite painting is the oh dear, now I'm blanking on. It's a National Gallery. Has no one in it. Winterfields. It's not Winterfields, but it's anyway. Snow flurries. And so one of the things that happened was Andrew Wyeth had me take a deer out of a painting once. That Betsy said the deer was very ineffective, and so I said, now a conservator, everything we do is reversible, but if I take out this deer, it's not reversible. So we had to sign a great many things, but we worked under the microscope, took off the deer, and left just the footprints, and he loved it. Then after we did this, he said, because the Farnsworth was showing Christina's World, he said, let's sneak in and take out Christina. Because it is Christina's World, it's not about Christina. And so the snow flurries at the National Gallery is that. Oh, here we go. Thank you, David. It is about nothing, sort of, but it is this beautiful landscape that brings out all this emotion in you, and that's what he wanted. He always said he wanted to be invisible, and so he's invisible in that, but it brings out all this emotion from the absence of people, just that tiny little fence and the snow flurries.
Yeah, let me ask Henry for the same thing. Can you mention a couple of paintings, perhaps, that people don't necessarily associate with Wyeth that you think demonstrate powers that he had that are underrated or unappreciated?
Let me pick up on an earlier question, then I'll answer that. I think that one of the things that Andrew Wyeth does that's sort of amazing is the way he evokes things that you can't see but are somehow a presence in the painting. It often takes a moment to sort of figure out what he's doing in terms of viewpoint. Just for example, there's an early painting called The Hunter, which was actually reproduced on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. It takes a while, there's a hunter in the distance, you're looking down from a branch of a tree. It takes a while to realize that you're in the position of a squirrel that's about to be shot, and that this is a painting basically about death, although you don't realize that at first. In Christina's World, the viewpoint is standing from the family graveyard, and that sense of death sort of imbues the whole spirit of the painting. Similarly, in Groundhog Day, it's basically a portrait of Carl Kerner, but he's not there. But there are odd things. Just for example, the table has no fork or spoon. He eats only with his knife, and it takes you a while to figure this out. But there's an extraordinary sense of suspense to it. I'm not sure I could even give you the names of some of the Wyeth paintings I admire, but I guess I'd say that his drawings and watercolors, I think, are remarkably rich, and there are a lot of them that have still not been seen. Just for example, the recent show at the National Gallery of Art had 12 watercolors which had never been exhibited before from the 1940s. And I think that there's a whole world of Andrew Wyeth that hasn't even been seen yet, that is probably going to take another 50, 100 years for us to discover. And certainly some of his watercolors and dry brush watercolors. I mean, something like Far Away, a portrait of Jamie, the fact that Bernard Berenson admired that, I think is an interesting tribute. I think that there are a lot of things Wyeth did. And I guess I would just add to that, I think the overall technical level of his work is amazing. There are painters who do, 6 or a dozen really great paintings, but you look at their typical work and it's often, just not that exciting. I think with Andrew Wyeth, it's amazing how many, periodically I see a painting by him I've never seen before and I'm completely blown away by it.
Could I add something about the Hunter? Because that's one of my favorites too, and I have the image here. It's in the Toledo Museum of Art. Two things I want to say is, one, this was actually made for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post in 1943, and that was basically the last time that Andrew Wyeth did any sort of commercial art, because, well, for one thing, Betsy Wyeth forbade him to keep doing that, and for another, he didn't want to end up like his father, being frustrated by being recognized only as an illustrator. And unfortunately, I think that Andrew Wyeth has been tagged with the illustrator label, even though after the early 40s he never made illustrations. In fact, he reacted against the storytelling quality of N.C. Wyeth's art. So that, again, is a sort of complicated relationship between father and son. And unfortunately for Andrew Wyeth, to be labeled an illustrator simply because his father was one, I think is an indication of people just not looking at the work. And we can talk more about that when we get to the critical reception. But one of the things I love about the Hunter and those other early 40s temperas is the incredible detail and exactitude. That really is the point when I think Wyeth is painting every blade of grass. And there's a kind of intensity, a kind of real commitment to just creating the most rich and complex and detailed view of the world that he can achieve. That's really astonishing. And, I would put those against anything else as some of his greatest works.
Well, go ahead.
Sorry. Could I add one more thing about the emotion that's buried in these works? Because Henry's discussion of the winter of 46, his father is killed on October 19th, 1945, and he paints a neighbor boy, Johnny Lynch, running down a hill, not knowing where to go. And it's full of the emotion. Here we go. Thank you. Of his loss of his father, but it doesn't say that anywhere. It just has a boy running down a hill, and you've got the railroad tracks where he was killed, and it's Kerner's Hill, right where his father was killed. This was used, incidentally, the world was beginning to catch on, for the cover of Museum News following 9/11, of where do we go next. But my favorite story on Winter 46 is that Richard Merriman, as the family representative, went to an exhibition at the Hermitage in Russia, and a girl was crying in front of that painting. And he went up and through the interpreter found out that she just had no knowledge of Andrew Wyeth and his biography. She was crying in front of that painting and was saying, he has lost something. He has lost something. And she was crying. And so, forgive me the comparison, but I understand the movie like Water for Chocolate, where they cook and cry, the person eats it and cries. And there's something going on there where he's put little grenades. Another friend of mine reacts that way to it's Night at Kerner's. There's a light on in the bedroom, and Carl Kerner is dying. And that's why the light is on there. And people have no idea who Carl Kerner is or that he's dying, and they look at that painting and they cry. So there are these little buried grenades of emotion that he is able to put in these paintings that is rather extraordinary.
Well, before we move on to some of the more iconic paintings that are associated with Andrew Wyeth, I just want to pick up on 2 points that were made earlier. Henry had made a good point that I've often said about art when he mentioned how there's a number of painters who have a handful of paintings, and then the quality of their work sort of falls off a cliff. And coming from the world of poetry, you see that all the time. Probably the most famous one is T.S. Eliot, who has maybe literally a handful of poems, and then it's nothing but garbage. But a bigger point that was made, I think it was Joyce who had made it, was talking about the point of view from far above and Wyeth's being trained to use his imagination. Because when you look at the last 30 some years of art, whether it's film, whether it's writing, whether it's poetry, whether it's visual arts, dancing, there's this obsession with the personal, that everything that's associated with the I has to be expressed rather than the intellect, and getting outside yourself, empathizing with another point of view. The squirrel painting is a good example too of that, to get outside of yourself, because you get sort of this I think very solipsistic art that's obsessed with the self in all these forms. And I think Andrew Wyeth, and I was just thinking about this while we were talking, is probably one of the exemplars of someone who could get away from himself, who could put himself in the form or the mind or the emotion of another being, whether that is an animal or a person. I was thinking about the painting, the hunting painting, about the beast hanging from the tree and the house, and you have the home or the building there, the representation of humanity, and then you have the natural thing hanging there, the dead thing, and there's that space between. And I'm just thinking in my mind's eye, trying to see it, and that's something that always reminds me of Vermeer, in that there's always this distance between things, but it's a useful distance. It's a distance that isn't necessarily lonely, but Wyeth, in that sort of empty space, fills it with something. And in mentioning the things about the boy running down the hill, anyway, that just came to mind. So I just wanted to mention that. But let's talk about now some of the more famous works. Obviously, there's Christina's World and the Helga sequence, but those were not the only paintings. Let's talk about a handful of some of his other major works, if you want to thrust some of them up, and then we'll hit Christina and Helga in a bit. Maybe David. Yeah, go ahead,
Well,
David.
Dan, since you really like this one, here's
Yeah,
10-inch Farmer
yeah, yeah.
with that dead deer hanging from a tree outside that old brick house. This is, I believe, in the Delaware Art Museum collection. Joyce probably knows this picture well. Yeah, this is, I think, an underrated one, and really has a lot of what we love in Wyeth. That kind of quality of a rural existence that's sort of hard and austere, but has that very sort of stripped down beauty.
And I believe it's a brick house, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, and so it's something that's man-made. It isn't like a log cabin. So you have the definite humanity. There's the element of the human there versus the natural.
right, right. Winter was his favorite season because of its austerity and the way that the landscape was not lush and verdant, but was austere and barren. There is, we've talked a lot about his emotion, but Henry mentioned correctly that it's muted. Visually, except for those explosive watercolors, the work does have this kind of somber, quiet, really introspective quality. So again, it goes against the grain of abstract expressionism or pop art, which is loud and brash, and attempting to be much more sort of extroverted. I think Wyeth's art is more introverted and withdrawn. But I agree with you, Dan, that he's also able to sort of provide a viewpoint that feels like it's outside of himself. Joyce mentioned, he's often quoted as saying that he wished he were invisible. He also said he wished he could be his dog, who just sort of wanders around the landscape unobserved and, able to observe everything without a sense of self-consciousness. The fact that he paints sitters with their eyes averted was in large part because he didn't want to be self-conscious in painting them. He wanted to imagine that he wasn't actually in the room with them and that he was somehow observing them in a disembodied way. So I think you're onto something there, that sort of detachment, which is paradoxically also animated by this extreme emotional investment. Wyeth is full of contradictions, and that's just one of them.
Yeah, David, I was just looking, and it seems he was born actually on the centenary of Thoreau, and I think Thoreau has a famous passage in Walden where he goes, "I became a transparent eyeball, lifted up from and that you certainly get, I think, that transparent eyeball in Wyeth.
That's Emerson, but
Oh, it's Emerson. Okay.
yeah, fellow transcendentalist. But you're right about him being born on Thoreau's centenary.
I wanted to add a thing.
To add a thought, which is, I think that one of the things that's extraordinary about Andrew Wyeth is his sense of mortality, and that was partly associated with his father's death, but also he went through most of his life with an infected lung. This probably went back to early childhood. It's something somewhat similar to tuberculosis, although it's a different bacteria. One of his lungs was removed, the other was infected. If you think of breath as something that's very much associated with being alive, this is someone where every time he takes a breath, he's not sure if he's going to have a chance to do that again. I think the irony is that, with only one lung and that one infected, he's living this very rugged life, going out painting in winter outdoors, really pushing himself in a way that most people don't. And of course, all his healthy friends are dying and dropping away, and he somehow kept going. But I remember at the end of his life, he was painting out in Maine, and he passed out and had to be airlifted off the island. But this is someone for whom mortality is a very real issue, and I think that that is evident in his paintings. There's an interesting contrast between his father's work and his work. N.C. Wyeth has a great sense of physicality and of muscular figures, and most of the key figures in N.C. Wyeth's painting are N.C. Wyeth himself. He's acting out the part of those people. And I think with N.C. Wyeth, there's an extraordinarily ghost-like quality to everything. All his people, even when you see every detail, there's a sense of a ghost-like transience. And I think that's very much connected with Andrew Wyeth's sense of mortality.
Let's then talk about some of the two, I guess, most famous works, and Helge is a series, but let's start, I guess, with Christina's World. That to me has always seemed to be sort of the American Scream by, I think it's Munch, in that it's relentlessly parodied. It's immediately recognizable, even if you know nothing about painting, American painting, Andrew Wyeth, even world painting. People know the image, even if they don't know the name. They know the crippled girl. What do you think? What do you think about the painting has made it like that, given it that Munch or Mona Lisa-like quality of being transcendent above its time and place? Is it because it did occur at a certain, it made its debut at a certain time, or is it something that just transcends time, do you think? Anyone?
Well, let me start. The late 1940s is a sort of anxious time in the United States, and there is a sense of anxiety in that picture if you look at it closely. But I want to start out by saying I think most people don't actually know the story behind that painting, and don't look at it closely, don't realize that Christina is in fact a paraplegic, that she had no use of her legs at that point. And she dragged herself around by her arms. So the fact that she's at the bottom of that field looking up toward her house is an indication of basically the extent of her world physically, that she could crawl that far down and then has to turn around and crawl back up. I think most people who just know the painting superficially think that she's this beautiful young girl down in a field on a pleasant summer day, and they have a kind of sentimental understanding of a painting that is actually more about tragedy and the will to overcome adversity. So I think, again, these, I mentioned the contradictions. I think there's a case of a contradiction between Wyeth's intention and many people's perception of that picture as being pleasant. And the other point I'll make is that the fact that her back is turned to us allows for all sorts of projections into that picture. We can read anything we want into that figure, including her being, a beautiful young girl, instead of actually a middle-aged disabled woman, because of that very effective decision that Wyeth made to have her with her back turned to us.
That's a Howard Pyle principle.
Well, I think if I could just say one thing, I don't know if it's necessarily needed to know the biography of Christina, because you can get multiple layers. If you know the biography of who the real Christina was, it certainly adds dimension. But I know when you look at it just from someone as a non-painter, I've always gotten that kind of Dorothy Gale from Kansas looking at the Wizard of Oz's city off in the corner. It's something seemingly unattainable to this woman at that moment in that position. Whether, I mean, you can look from sort of her wizened limbs that she's probably ill in some way, but I think personally that's probably one of the reasons that people it's a desideratum that's out there, that can this person get up? Can they get it?
Right.
So that's just my personal opinion. Go ahead, Joyce. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Well, another thing I wanted to add is the whole business of the Olson house, and the fact that the people come. The New York Times did an article on it calling it America's Lourdes. That people come to the Olson house, crippled people put aside their crutches and crawl up the hill. All kinds of people, and of course now we're in the world of selfies, so it's tripled, I'm sure. But the whole idea of coming to that house, they have a comment book that's been going now for over 20 years, where people from all over the world, from Japan and Germany, come to this house. People are married in the house. They come back every anniversary and write in the comment book. They make quilts and they put pictures of the quilts in the comment book. And it's about Christina, it's about the house. People may know, as you say, nothing about the biography, but the house means to them their grandmother and a hardscrabble life in Maine. And everyone reads into this ghost-like house what they want. And so not only Christina, but as you say, the Emerald City at the top of the hill has become this extraordinary emotional flashpoint for people who come constantly every year, and then, oh, I've come again and brought my new little baby. I've come again, the baby is now 10. And they are just coming back to this house with their association not only of the painting but the house. And then back to the meaning of tempera, there was a wonderful quote where a man wrote and said, I have come to this house so my dust can mingle with the dust of Christina Olson and the dust of Andrew Wyeth. And Andrew said he wanted his temperas to be like the dust of the Olson house and the dry shingles and so forth.
Henry?
I just wanted to add, I think Christina's world belongs to a very odd category of painting. It's an iconic painting which, for some reason, people instantly remember and it becomes part of their lives. I think in American art, you've got two other paintings that are like that. One is Nighthawks by Edward Hopper. The other is American Gothic by Grant Wood. These are paintings where when you see the painting, you're almost surprised that it's a physical object because it's something that sticks in your mind in a way that seems to have no physical substance. And I think that's rather different from most paintings where you get involved in how they fit into the history of art or how skillfully they're painted or whatever. There's some way and how would I say, it's a sort of artistic home run, but of a very peculiar sort. And even if you're Andrew Wyeth, you can't do this very often in your lifetime. No one seems to quite understand what it is to make a painting of this type. I'd say the other thing that's peculiar about Christina's world is that it looks like a very realistic, closely observed representation, but he actually made that painting from inside the house. So he's inside the house imagining what it looks like from the outside. His main model is he has a little piece of grass in his hand, which he's looking at when he paints the field. But I think that the whole psychological process of creating that painting is extremely strange and much more imaginative than we realize, and that it is just an extremely odd painting that sort of fits in a category different from most other works of art.
It does, Dan, speak to your point about Wyeth being able to imagine another point of view. So, as Henry correctly says, Wyeth was working in an upstairs bedroom of the Olsen house, on the floor to which Christina herself could no longer ascend because of her mobility limitations. But he saw her picking blueberries down in the field, and actually, if you look closely at Christina's world, her hands are stained blue. And you're right. I mean, her limbs are sort of gnarled. Um, there are all kinds of stories behind the picture, but I agree with Henry that it's a very odd painting in that regard. And Wanda Corn has convincingly linked it to surrealism. I mean, the quality of it, there's almost a dreamlike, visionary intensity to that picture, which I think is part of what accounts for its iconic status that Henry has rightly noted.
I might just interject something else you were mentioning, parodies of Christina's World. But there's Richard Merriman actually had a little parody that Andrew Wyeth made where there was a fashion advertisement of a girl crawling up a hillside, and Andrew Wyeth basically sketched Christina's house up in the upper right-hand side of it. And it's a very funny image, but it's also amazing where basically working from memory, he was able to exactly, with a few lines, create the feeling of the painting and the laundry hanging on the line and this kind of thing. And I think it's extraordinary the way Wyeth absorbed his subject matter so that when he's painting a house, it's almost like a computer program. He can rotate it in space in his head. When he's doing a house, he could probably do architectural blueprints of that house. His understanding of it is so complete. And there's some of that intensity of absorbing a subject that I think comes through in the painting.
Well, let's end this segment talking about the Helga sequence. And I know when Wyeth died about 6 years ago, it might have been a year or two before, a year or two after. I remember the network newses were having, the typical gossip-laden stuff about whether or not Wyeth and Helga were involved or whatnot, and that tended to obscure the artistic achievement, pro or con, of the sequence. So let's talk about who Helga was, what her relationship to Wyeth was, personally and artistically, and how that influenced this now famous sequence. And have all the paintings been released in the Helga sequence?
What do you mean released?
I mean, are they all known, or are they uncatalogued works?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
We
they
have
are.
the whole body of work.
Okay.
And it's mostly drawings.
Okay.
There are only a handful of temperas and some watercolors, but the majority is drawings, wouldn't you say, Joyce?
Yes, there's 234 or something like that, and some were visible sooner because he would disguise Helga, like he made her African American at one point, and he would bring some things home to show Betsy because, as one of you said, he can do 2 and 3 watercolors a day, but only usually 2 temperas a year. So whenever he was doing a Helga tempera, Betsy, this was all done without Betsy knowing. Betsy would wonder why he wasn't bringing home any temperas, so he had to double the tempera output in order to keep bringing home. Betsy was his curator, his cataloger, and she named all the paintings, so she expected to see them at regular intervals. And so while he was painting Helga in secret, he had to produce a certain number of temperas to bring home. So he had to go up to 4 and 5 a year and bring home some temperas of Helga in disguise by using slightly different faces, saying, oh, this is just a girl I met, and so forth. So it's a very complicated story. But he met Helga. She was Karl Kerner's nurse, and she is Prussian, born in 1939, still alive. You can see the wonderful interview of her again by Michael Palin, where she says perhaps more than she says in any other videoed interview. But her husband Johnny worked at Longwood Gardens, and if you go to Longwood Gardens, you can see, Dan, your tenant farmer house. It's right there on Route 1. But in any case, Johnny had brought her there, and she was Karl Kerner's nurse. And in the early photographs, Helga looks like Gidget. She's 5 foot tall and a tiny person, and she could carry Karl Kerner up the steps. and looked after him. And supposedly there was this epiphany moment where she was having the vacuum, and Andrew Wyeth saw her and then started painting her in secret. Carl Kerner was aiding and abetting, and Andrew's sister Carolyn was aiding and abetting space for Helga to be painted eventually in the nude, but during this time. So it's about 234, and a great many are watercolors and drawings. And I can't say, maybe 8 or 10 temperas. But then it's complicated because some of the temperas are not are Helga, but not really Helga.
But the secrecy was crucial to Wyeth because it allowed him to maintain this creative intensity without having Betsy looking over his shoulder or somehow affecting his creative process in this very intimate way. And every one of the pictures is just Helga alone, either in a room or out in nature. So again, that's Wyeth's preferred. And there are very few pictures by Andrew Wyeth that show more than one person. I mean, there's that one of Carl and Anna Kerner, maybe a few of the very early pieces. But that sense of one-on-one of Wyeth and his model in this very private and intense relationship. And of course, you mentioned, the speculation about whether or not Andrew Wyeth and Helga Tesdorf had an affair. And we really, I mean, I think the consensus is no, they didn't. But Wyeth at one point said that would have ruined the whole artistic relationship if it became a physical relationship. That the emotional connection between them was expressed artistically and not physically.
I should add one other thing about the secrecy is that before painting Helga, he painted Siri, a beautiful young girl in Maine, and he painted her sitting only topless, naked. And then Betsy said, "Why don't you do the whole thing? Go the whole way." He painted Siri nude, and then Betsy, this is a beautiful painting. She's in a chicken coop and chicken house.
This was also yeah.
I just interviewed Siri this summer, and can you put the painting back? Because I have a wonderful to tell, which is there's sun coming across her breasts, and it comes from a tiny little window up in the top of the chicken house, and she's on a series of steps, and he could only paint for an hour before the sun moved. So what she said she had to do is back up the steps to keep the sun going across her, so they could only paint from something like 8 in the morning till 11 on the 3 steps when the sun ray would stop coming across her. But in any case, this is the Virgin of Siri. And so then he was doing another nude of Siri, and Betsy lost her temper, and he was doing a nude of Siri that she didn't know about it. And she said, "If you do this again, I don't want to know about it." And then come the Helga series.
Let me.
I was just going to add that I think the whole relationship with Andrew and Betsy is pretty interesting. Betsy was an extraordinarily perceptive but also ruthless critic of his work, and she thought up the titles for his paintings, which are often amazing titles. I mean, I think Christina's World is an amazing title, Wind from the Sea. These are titles that, are worthy. They're almost poems in their evocative quality. And so she also played a major role. And I might say that if you visit the Wyeth house, she had an extraordinary talent, I guess you'd say, as an interior decorator, but created a kind of Wyeth look, which has become part of the American consciousness.
I was going to ask, was it because she was the business end, she knew how to market through the words, or was he just indifferent to naming his paintings?
I think it was because she was left out of the artistic process. She could not visit the studio and got in a lot of trouble if she tried to come unannounced. So their arrangement, so to say, was he would bring the painting home. There would be a little ceremony actually where he signed it, and sometimes we'd get to vote where he would sign it, and of course he would do what he wanted it anyway. But but
let
you
me
could
just
just pretend to be able to vote. And then Betsy would do the naming. And sorry, I think about the what is it? The T.S. Eliot poem. The naming of cats is a difficult matter. It isn't just one of your family games. A cat may have whatever, it's three different names. Some of the paintings had seven names as Betsy would go through choosing the name. So this was a very special ritual. And she would have the Oxford English Dictionary open. She would talk about all the possible meanings of words that could be chosen. And so there'd be sometimes seven names and sometimes seven frames, as they would. Betsy had a lot to do with framing too, and would take out all of her charcoal gray towels and put them along the top of the frame and say, "Isn't this a better color? Joyce, go repaint the frame." And so things like that would happen. So she had to have that part. She got to be part of the framing and the naming.
I might say that there's an interesting contrast of temperament there, because Betsy was very much a neat freak and in some ways very controlling. And the irony that this control freak marries the one person you can never control. And Andrew Wyeth's studio was a pig pen where you could hardly get through it. And after he died, they needed to get a professional snake person to get the snakes out at the basement, because he had just let everything sort of decay and go wild. So that there is an interesting, how would I say, reciprocity of those two people, but also a continuous tension of temperament between them, which clearly was a creative spark for both of them. And I mean, this would be another story, but Betsy was also a great person and, wonderfully creative person.
All right. Well, let's end this segment. And in the next segment, I want to talk about sort of the whole family line from NC down to Jamie Wyeth, what preceded and what came after. And then later in the show, we'll talk a little bit about critical reception and the legacy of Wyeth, and we'll do that in a moment. Well, I mentioned earlier that the Wyeths were an artistic family, but the three most famous, obviously, are the grandfather, or NC, then Andrew, and then Jamie Wyeth. So let's talk a little bit about the sort of family legacy. We haven't talked that much about Jamie. We talked about NC and his influence on Andrew. Let's talk about the younger Wyeth, Jamie, who's now probably in his 60s, I guess. Where does he fit in, artistically from NC and Andrew? Is he somewhere in the middle, or is he striking out on his own?
Well, he began painting. It's interesting. A study of Andrew and Betsy have two sons, Jamie and Nicholas. And Nicholas made model airplanes and things of that sort, and they both drew and painted. And there's a point at which they separate, and you can start seeing that Jamie is going to go forward with art, and Nicky will stay with airplanes and other things, boats and whatnot. But Jamie, there's some wonderful things in the current Jamie show that went from the MFA Boston to, I'm not sure I can do this, to it ended up in Crystal Bridges. But there's one of Jamie where he's painting on one of his father's paintings. So he's there in the studio at the age of 12. He leaves school, as Andrew left school and was taught at home starting from the first grade. Jamie left school at the age of 12. He said the reason was he read The Once and Future King and got very excited about learning from nature. Well, why would that be? That would be because of the heritage of NC and Andrew and the farm and the sea and all of that. And so he was tutored at home, and had one of those things that are done with movie star children, so that he has all these teachers and all these books and does the grades. And then in the afternoon, he painted with his Aunt Carolyn. And he said that he tried tempera, but it didn't suit him. And when you talk to him, he almost always refers to his grandfather, and that he caught fire, as he put it, looking at his grandfather's work and going up to his grandfather's studio and trying on the costumes and knowing about Howard Pyle, collecting his grandfather and Howard Pyle's paintings. And so you've got this generation skip, but they were best friends, but also rivals, just like Andrew and NC. And Richard Merriman would talk about how owners who would collect both Andrew and Jamie, if any of us visited one of those owners, Andrew would say, "Who does he have over the fireplace?" So each of the paintings are getting the central position at this point. But Jamie went into, he did only one painting of Merlin, interestingly enough, with the Once and Future King, in tempera. But after that, it was oil and mixed media. And Jamie does an awful lot of work with animals. Very beautiful. He's a great animalier. Time alone with ravens and gulls and pigs. He would paint the cows and sit up on the truck and kick off bales of whatever the cows eat to keep them grouped around that. He raised a buzzard, and he kept a shark in a tank. And here's this wonderful, David is holding up the painting of a sheep on Manana. Jamie has a home on Monhegan, which is right next to Manana, and there was this ram that hung out on Manana. And Jamie, they all have dogs, and Jamie had a great big dog named Boom Boom, and this sheep ran down the hill and butted Boom Boom. But in any case, Jamie painted that ram, and it's kind of an islander, it's the name of it, squeezing out the oil, not something Andrew would do, squeezing out the oil from the tube and taking his paintbrush and stabbing it into the oil to make the sheep wool. And so he's very interested in being with the animals, seeing from the point of view. He painted this fabulous pig, which is one of the favorite paintings at the Brandywine River Museum. Again, look up close and it looks like a Jackson Pollock. But the pigs, and the hog king of Nebraska diagnosed an actual ailment. He painted the pig's snout so perfectly when the pig was on display, Den at the Joslin Museum. So this extreme empathy to animals. He actually painted another pig from inside the big pen with the pig looking out at the snow, as he painted Nureyev from inside the prompter's box. So, and Jamie loves pigs, and he painted the Kennedys. That's a whole nother story. But he said his highest compliment to Ted Kennedy was that he had pig eyes. And he said, and I mean this as a great compliment, because how smart pigs are. And there's another wonderful moment where he's best friends with Andy Warhol for 10 years, and one of their recorded interviews at the Warhol Museum is all about pigs. And Andy Warhol starts painting pigs after talking to Jamie, and they're in the car with Paulette Goddard, who's talking about how smart pigs are and having pigs as pets. So Jamie has had more time, perhaps with celebrities and living in New York, than Andrew, but has become very much, a long answer to your short question, his own person, doing things with Andy Warhol, Nureyev, and then Lincoln Kirsten, of course, moved from Andrew to Jamie and made sure Jamie could paint in the morgue in New York and sponsored Jamie for years. And Jamie did a fabulous portrait of Lincoln Kirsten with his back, again, the Howard Pyle back.
Henry or David, any comments on Jamie Wyeth?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of things about Jamie that are interesting. One is that rather than looking at his father's work, he looked very much at his grandfather's work. And then I do think that the whole New York thing is interesting. Jamie clearly inherited the mantle of being a Wyeth, but also wanted to break out of that. And, as Joyce was saying, he was very close to Andy Warhol. I think Lincoln Kirstein was a huge influence on Jamie Wyeth. And I might also say that being a Wyeth is sort of a double-sided legacy. It does get you an entree into the art world and to art dealers and a kind of understanding on how the art world works. Jamie has also had brutal treatment, from the part of critics, many of whom, like Hilton Kramer, seem to have had an almost personal animus. They were really out to destroy him. And there's a toughness to Jamie Wyeth that is sort of extraordinary. And I might say that also, at this point, it's impressive how much good work he's produced. He's really kept at it as an artist. And, I just wish he would write his memoirs, because he has known all these remarkable art world characters. I might say that Andy Warhol said of Jamie Wyeth, Warhol, of course, was famous for being strange, but he was saying, "Who's strange? This is someone who keeps a wolf and his pig in his bedroom." It's Jamie Wyeth who's the strange one. And yeah, he is an unusual and fascinating guy, and quite a raconteur, as his father was also.
They both could be actors easily.
Yes, yeah. And one common thing is they both love to dress up in extraordinary costumes. And yeah.
Halloween.
David, any comments on Jamie?
I don't have an image with me, but I would just recommend that your viewers look up Jamie Wyeth's portrait of Warhol from, what is it, 1976 or so, Joyce?
Yeah.
It's an astonishing work of art. It's Warhol with his fright wig, the kind of gray wig that he wore, and his big glasses, and he's holding a dog and looking straight out at the viewer. And it's a remarkable characterization. That painting alone, I think, earns Jamie Wyeth a place in the history of art that is really quite remarkable. And I agree with what Joyce and Henry have said about other aspects of his work and what distinguishes it from his father's.
We talked about Andrew Wyeth and the critics earlier, and one of the writers that I associate in my mind's eye with a sort of Wyethian kind of view, and I don't know if you are familiar with poetry, is Robinson Jeffers. Jeffers was a poet who wrote about Big Sur, California. He wrote about rocks and hawks, and he had this view of life called inhumanism. Not that he was inhuman, but that it was outside of the human domain. And I've always thought that Wyeth was sort of the visual equivalent of Jeffers. And Jeffers was one of the most famous poets of the 20s and 30s. He even made a cover of Time magazine. And yet, because he was against World War II, his career suffered critically, even though now it's been resurrected with the modern green movement, and because he was very much a naturalist in his viewpoint. And I'm wondering to what degree, what were Andrew Wyeth's religious and or political views, and I'm wondering if that had anything to do with his sort of denigration at mid 20th century, aside from his actual production, his actual work. Did his own persona, his own views, religious or politically, have anything to do with it?
Well, Wyeth was associated with Republican politics. I mean, he wasn't outspokenly political by any means, but excuse me, he was known to be a supporter of Dwight Eisenhower, and perhaps even worse for his reputation, he supported Richard Nixon, and Pat and Richard Nixon hosted a show of Wyeth at the White House in the early 1970s. So you can see how that wouldn't sit well with the more liberal wing of the avant-garde, meaning the avant-garde. I mean, avant-garde art has almost always been associated with left-wing politics, or at least liberal politics. So Wyeth, I think, does become seen by some as not only artistically but also politically conservative. And I think that's still the case today. He was also honored at the White House by George W. Bush a few years before he died. So politically, he is associated with the right end of the spectrum, but I don't know why that has to affect how we relate to his art. I'd also point out that it was President Kennedy who nominated Wyeth for the National Medal of Freedom that was bestowed on him by President Johnson. So he was honored at the White House by both Democrat and Republican presidents. So that's the political side of it. In terms of religion, my sense is that he wasn't really religious. Joyce can confirm or deny that.
Yeah, I can answer that one. His favorite historical character was George Washington, and he felt that Washington was a deist and that he was a deist, and that Washington always used the term providence. And so he would say that he believed in providence, and was interested in the fact that there's his painting that looks like a cross with a piece of shredded cloth on it has been interpreted as a cross when it's just simply a shredded scarecrow actually in a field. And he really admired Washington, has read every biography on Washington, and especially the relationship of Washington and Lafayette, because Lafayette was buried with a bit of Brandywine mud in his coffin for the Battle of Brandywine. So his allegiance is his extreme historical allegiance, and so that's what I know of the deism.
Henry, any comments?
I might just say that, and Joyce would know more about this than I do, but my sense is that Andrew Wyeth was in fact rather Republican and conservative in his politics, and frankly, I always found that was a delicate issue. And talking with him, my dad was the first name on Nixon's enemies list, so I was sort of at the opposite pole. But my sense is that Jamie is probably a little bit tilted the other way. Jamie was very close to the Kennedys, and
Phyllis worked for John Kennedy, so
yeah,
they canceled each other's votes. Betsy and Henry voted Republican, and Jamie and Phyllis voted Democrat. And but they both did Christmas cards for all the different presidents. And I have a picture of me doing an Obama fist bump with Andy, with the Time magazine cover of Obama doing the fist bump. So he was excited about Obama.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk now about the legacy of Andrew Wyeth specifically. You earlier was mentioned he's coming back a little bit, I guess, into vogue. Where do you see him now, say at mid-century and by the end of this century? Do you think that time will, put him up in the canon, and 100 years from now, people will be talking about him the way they do of an Akins or a Homer, or even in world painting, the way they might do of a Goya or Magritte or some of the big European names?
Well, in terms of world painting, he has been for a long time more revered in Japan and also in China than he has been in the United States. So, one of the knocks against Wyeth by his critics in the late 60s is that he was provincial and that, really didn't play much outside of, the northeastern United States. But that was disproven by the intense interest that the Japanese and Chinese had in his work in the 70s and 80s and to the present. I mean, he's like a god to a lot of the Japanese. So, I wouldn't want to predict how he will be viewed 100 years from now. I would just, because I'm an historian, not a fortune teller, but I would say that his stock has risen in the last decade or so. That he was basically written off in the 1970s, and he's always been a big draw in museums. He's always been popular with the public, and there are a lot of good reasons for that. But I do feel like his critics and opponents have sort of either they've also left the scene or they're less influential now. So I do think that younger generations don't view Wyeth with the kind of bias that their elders did. So I do think that bodes well for his future reputation.
Joyce?
Yes, I think Wanda, going back to Wanda Corn, calls Andrew a metaphoric realist. And I think that works. That includes surrealism. That includes all. What has not happened in the past was Andrew was looked at in isolation, partly because of the geography. But now, for instance, Patty Junker of Seattle has brought him, comparing him to Duchamp. And so as we get more and more into people looking without bias and putting him into wonderful ping pong with other artists of the time, I think that will really increase excitement. And the metaphoric, the like water for chocolate factor of metaphoric realism. I think future people are going to keep mining the many meanings of his work, because one of the I feel that work that has multiple interpretations will live longest. And when Andy would unveil a painting, you were to give an extreme stream of consciousness set of reactions. This reminds me of a tunnel. This reminds me of an explosion. And he wanted all of these different reactions to be valid. And I think that's a good recipe for longevity.
Henry?
I think there are a number of issues, and I think that the way he's seen is changing. I'd say that the period when he came to the fore in American art, the 1960s, was a period when a lot of people had a connection with rural America. Even if they lived in the city, they were familiar with rural America, and also New England at the time when the New England farm was dying as a way of life. I think there was a little bit of nostalgic quality to Andrew Wyeth's work. Part of the reaction against his work was a kind of New York reaction of people who are familiar with city life but have no experience of rural life and think of it as a kind of picture postcard rather than as something that has a real existence. I don't know that that's going to come back, but I think that we're starting to see Andrew Wyeth in new ways. I'd say that one of the interesting sort of footnotes to his influence is the extraordinary influence he's had on filmmakers. And, going back to King Vidor, who made scenes in his movies that were based on Wyeth paintings. But I think that, there are whole movies that have been made to have a kind of Andrew Wyeth look to the way the scenes are shot. And I don't think anyone anticipated that there would be a comeback of art historical interest in the way that there has. It's a very peculiar phenomenon, something I've seen some parallels to it. John Singer Sargent, for example, is another painter who was reviled and then was brought back into the canon. But the Wyeth phenomenon is very peculiar, and I do think that we're starting to look at his work in psychological terms. And in some ways, I would almost place him outside the history of painting, in that I think that one of the things you get in Wyeth's painting is an extraordinary sense of character in the paintings of Christina, the Kerner Farm. I think almost of people like Shakespeare and that kind of thing. And I think that the fact that his father illustrated classic novels is something that is very deeply embedded in the way that Wyeth thinks about the world. He's thinking in a different way than most painters. I would say that I actually have trouble dealing with Andrew Wyeth in my surveys of American art. I tend to deal with him briefly or leave him out because he just doesn't, he's such a singular figure. But in some ways, I think that's going to be a strength in the years to come, where there's nothing like him. And I think for various reasons, now painters work with Photoshop and with a whole different set of techniques. I think that Wyeth did things technically which we're never going to see again in the history of art, or at least not for a long time. And he's someone who has these amazing technical skills, but then uses them in a thoughtful, expressive way to, express things about mortality and human existence. So I think that he's going to survive as an artist, though, what his place is going to be is sort of hard to figure out at this point.
Henry, let me start with you then. Let's wrap up the show. And if you could say just for a minute or two to maybe any people who are not familiar with Wyeth, why they should get familiar, and any other closing remarks you might have, please go ahead.
Well, I think.
Well, no, let me go, Henry, first.
Why don't you go first?
Go ahead, Joyce.
Give me a moment to
think.
And you clearly, I'm completely tongue-tied on this one.
Okay, go ahead, Joyce.
Well, I like to quote some people who were Wyeth haters who became Wyeth lovers at the show at the Philadelphia Museum, Memory and Magic, because they actually looked. And so, to quote one of them, the idea was that they had always scorned him, rural, a realist, not New York, all the things that Henry and David have said, but they looked up close at the paintings for the first time because it was at the Philadelphia Museum and they thought they should. And so they did. And they fell in love. They went from painting to painting and gave due time to looking up close. And that can happen. And if you can have that kind of aesthetic experience and also emotional experience with, and it was called Memory and Magic, and people found both memory and magic in the painting. So highly recommended.
David, then you want to?
I would echo what Joyce said. Whenever you have the chance to actually encounter and spend time with a Wyeth, just absorb what it has to offer. I think he is a distinctive American artist. I agree with Henry that he's hard to categorize, that he's kind of an individualist. And, you know, the history of art likes movements. We like to have artists who band together for a common cause. And Wyeth is another very American type, the loner, the artist who refuses to conform, who refuses to, you know, follow trends. So I think that's also valuable in his work to just appreciate his distinctive vision, and you know, he does offer things that you're not going to find elsewhere. You're not going to find it in abstract expressionism or pop or the more recent movements. There is something enduring and deeply American about Wyeth's work that I do think is worth seeking out and appreciating.
Henry?
I might answer this anecdotally that at the time of the Philadelphia show, I arranged to have lunch with Andrew Wyeth and to bring along my wife and my son, who was 5 years old at the time, and I might say just 5. He'd been 5 only for a few weeks at that point. After that show, after that lunch, we went to the show at the Philadelphia Museum, and I was a little reluctant to do that because the experience of seeing Andrew Wyeth had been so rich. I didn't want to clutter it up with other emotions, and also I was emotionally drained already. But anyway, we went to that show. You know, my wife immediately found a painting that affected her so deeply that she burst into tears. It was a portrait of Carl and Anna Kerner, which is sort of a portrait of a marriage and a pretty grim marriage at that. So, but anyway, she was affected, and my son Tommy, who, as I say, was barely 5 years old, spent almost 2 hours in that show and wasn't bored. He found things he connected with. His favorite painting was a painting of pumpkins on Halloween. But I think that Andrew Wyeth's work somehow breaks through at an emotional level to people in a way that is quite astonishing. And there's certainly the technical side of that. He had technical gifts that are really pretty unique in the history of art, to be able to create paintings with such mastery of illusionism. But there's this emotional quality that is quite extraordinary about his work. And you know, Christina's World is an example of that, even in a poster, there's something just intensely emotional about that painting, and, you know, really unforgettable. And I think that, you know, that's something that's going to speak to future generations as it does to us today.
Well, I want to thank Henry, Joyce, and David for sharing their thoughts about Andrew Wyeth. As I mentioned, I'm not going to have any images available, but if you look below this video, you will see links to their websites, links to them, and I'll also put some links to some Wyeth images online. If you have heard them talk about a specific painting, you can actually go then just type it in and look it up, and I'd encourage people to do that. Tomorrow, I will be switching up gears. I'll be talking about 21st century media blogging and podcasting. But again, if you enjoyed Andrew Wyeth, please look him up. And again, thanks to my three guests.
I just wanted to thank you and David and Joyce. You were both fantastic. I, of course, am intensely envious of Joyce, who got to know Andrew Wyeth probably better than anyone. So, you know, I feel fortunate I met him, but intensely jealous of Joyce, who probably knew him better than anyone. So, anyway, thank you all.
All right. Goodbye.